Welcome to another scintillating episode of the What the Tech podcast, where we dive deeply into the inner workings of the tech world. Now, this episode is especially for those grappling with the complexity of software and in their quest to simplify and scale. The technology world can often be overwhelming with its intricate mechanisms and processes, but as Steve Jobs said, simple can be harder than complex, but it's worth it in the end because once you get there, you can move mountains. We believe that the key to success lies in simplicity. The simpler the software, the easier it is to scale, whether in terms of users, features, engineers, or global distribution. So today we bring you insights from a seasoned professional who has mastered the art of simplifying and scaling. Let's go. Today, we're delighted to welcome Brian Childress, the Principal Technical Advisor and Software Architect of Summit Labs. He holds many software patents and has been recognized as an industry leader in his field. Needless to say, Brian has worked tirelessly over the years to demystify complex software architectures and has empowered numerous companies to scale rapidly and efficiently. Welcome to the show, Brian.
Troy, man, it's great to be here.
Yeah, so it's been a long time coming. We've we had a sidebar conversation about how important it is for this specific topic today to really simplify things. But I always like to have a little bit of fun with my guests before we kind of kick that off. So I was hoping we could talk a little bit about specifically your work history. But if you could share maybe a funny or memorable blunder that you've seen in the software development space. You probably have a handful of those that you can share in your many years of working in the space.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There's quite a few that come to mind. I remember, I don't even remember how long ago it was, maybe 10 years ago. I was in a server room, racking and stacking my own servers for a client that I was working with, and there was an earthquake, and it shook everything in the server room. And we actually had servers bouncing off of racks. They fell off because they weren't completely screwed in all the way. We were still doing work actively in there when an earthquake hit. And I'm not in California. I'm not in earthquake territory. But I remember being in there and not knowing what that feeling was, and then having to pick up the pieces after everything was settled.
Holy cow! How big was this server room that you were in?
It wasn't big. It was an on-prem kind of setup, so maybe four distinct kind of freestanding racks. So it wasn't huge, but it was still pretty wild to be in there when that was going on.
I'm curious, which earthquake was this? Where were you, and how big was the earthquake?
So I was in Maryland, just outside of Baltimore, and I think the epicenter was somewhere here in Virginia that it hit. I don't remember exactly how big it was, but it was one of those. It was on the news for a while because Virginia just doesn't receive earthquakes. It's just not a thing.
Yeah. So I'm originally from California, and so earthquakes were not foreign to me. It was weird moving to Colorado where tornadoes was like a thing, right? Yeah. And now I live on the East Coast where, we get tornadoes. As a matter of fact, a tornado hit touched down here I guess it was this weekend, and tore up some houses here in Raleigh, North Carolina. But the preparation, the things that you do, in school, like growing up in primary school, are very different. So like, California, where we had earthquakes at least a couple times a year, it was weird because they were like, well, get under your desk and, hold your head. Whereas like with a tornado that you got to go to like a secure area, they would make the restrooms in schools, like a tornado shelter or something like that. And then being here on the East Coast, it's hurricanes, man. Like hurricanes, we get hit with those like once or twice a year. And it's not just about the wind. It's primarily for us a lot of times about like what, the rain for the most part, like how much flooding are we going to have inland. But on the coast, it's more about the wind. It's just weird how each part of the country has some sort of epic disaster that's likely to hit. But you're right, Virginia, not an epicenter for, earthquakes.
No, not at all.
I actually remember one story in an earthquake. This is a 7 point something earthquake when I was like 7, 8 years old. And I remember how scary that was because I woke up, it was like 7 o'clock in the morning. And I just remember I was on the top bunk of the bed because I was the older brother and I got to choose, right? And that's how it is. And I just remember the bunk bed was just doing this and it basically just chucked me off the bed. Now,
Oof.
it wasn't super far down and it was carpeted, so I didn't hurt myself, but I just remembered just being launched. So, and earthquakes were just kind of normal. I was kind of used to that, but that was the worst one I ever actually was in, was I think it was a 7.1 on the scale. So, hopefully it wasn't too scary for you, but that's a weird feeling. Like you kind of like doing this weird feeling, like your stomach feels weird. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I'd never experienced it before and I haven't experienced it again since. So it was just a wild feeling to not know what was going on. And then things started falling off of the racks and off of shelves and not quite sure what to do. Cause I didn't have all that, training in school.
Yeah, it's just one of those things where if you live in California, I'm convinced California is going to fall off into the middle of the Pacific Ocean at some point, but hopefully not. So ultimately today, we're here to better understand the best practices that are required to build software with intention of potentially scaling that and selling the company, or with the intention to build and hold. A lot of organizations are building software per se to supplement a part of their business, not necessarily as a core part of their business, right? And so with that overarching goal in mind, I'd like to dive in a little bit deeper with you. And with me and the listeners having an open mind to what we're trying to accomplish. Because you had mentioned in another podcast I listened to that intention for that software is super important, right? Because a lot of times people get over their skis primarily because they're not thinking about how am I going to use this technology? How is it going to be used by the, it could be, customer facing, could be internally facing. And you talked about how do you do this? There was something about a pain-driven process that you had mentioned that I thought was interesting. And so I wanted to know exactly what that was, but I also wanted to make sure that we frame this conversation around how do we look at the actual project and then build the software in its simplest, most effective, format.
It's a great question. And I think one that a lot of businesses are trying to figure out. Really, for me, I like to focus back on what is the business goal? What is it that we're trying to do with the software? I think a lot of times what we see as far as mistakes is that the technology drives a lot of how do we do business. And really, in my mind, it should be the inverse. The business and its goals should be the thing that drives how do we design the software? How do we work with the software day in and day out? And using those kind of concepts as a way to inform how do we want to build it? What are the tools that we want to use? What are the technologies that make sense? Understanding our customer. If it's an internal application, our customer may or may not be different than if it's an external application. And so I really like to understand what is it that we're doing for the business, and then, kind of work backwards from there. Because, as much as I love to play around with technology and, in order for that business to be able to afford my big fancy software engineer salary, it needs to be making money. And so I need to make sure that, as part of my job is to make sure that we're building something that can benefit the business and allow it to continue to grow.
So you're the fix-it guy, right? So you find yourself in there when they've made mistakes, right? Or they've got stuck and they don't know how to get out of their current predicament. So I'm curious, where did this idea, for you kind of come from? I'm sure it's, from your development kind of practices and experience, but where did this idea of just saying, okay, like, look, how do we make this simpler? Where did that come from? And then, what do you see that doing within the businesses that you're working with today? From a process standpoint, improving, like, how long does that take? A lot of times, like, what are some of your objectives as you get in there and you're talking to development teams? Maybe go through a little bit of that. That was a long-winded way to ask you, like, whoa, what you're doing every single day obviously matters, but like at the end of the day, like objectively, what are the problems that you're solving, and how are you doing?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. A lot of times the reason that I'm brought in is because things aren't working, whether the software itself isn't working, processes aren't working. There's a lot of instability in the system. Oftentimes that's when I join a project. And usually what I find is that the project or the technology, it's just too complex. There's too many moving pieces. It's really hard to understand. And Troy, I'm a simple guy, right? So the easier it is for me to understand, the better chance I have of being successful. And I find that's true with a lot of teams and a lot of projects that I work on, is that if things are too complex, it's really hard to understand. Folks get really, really frustrated. Both the development team gets frustrated and the business is frustrated because things just aren't moving smoothly and at the kind of the expected speed. And so we just, it's something like 70% of software projects end up failing. And that's a huge amount of projects that just will never, ever see the light of day. And as a developer, that's a very frustrating thing. And as a business that spent months and potentially millions of dollars to develop something that they ultimately can't use, that's also very frustrating. So a lot of times what I do is just trying to come in and understand, okay, what do we have? What has been built so far? And try to figure out why some of those things have been built in the way that they have, right? I can easily come in and say, oh, no, I don't like this technology. Let's throw it out. We need to build it with this new technology that I like. And a lot of times we see that happen in projects. But for me, what I try to do is really understand, how did we get here? What were the decisions that were made? What was the information that we had throughout the course of us building this software that led us to kind of get into this place? Because then we have to try and unwind that. A lot of that's cultural. A lot of those decisions and justifications and, the expectations, all of that kind of comes from the way that, you and I collaborate as a team. And, the technology is just the end result of that. So I want to make sure that any lessons that we've learned along that way don't get lost, and we don't just kind of throw it away and try again, but we try to, not repeat those same mistakes as we go through. And one of the biggest challenges for a business is that it's really hard for me to go to them and say, listen, I know we've spent, 6 months or 12 months building this, and you've spent a lot of money and you've got a lot of engineers, but ultimately it's no good and we have to throw it away. Instead of doing that, I want to figure out how can we, over time, convert that into something that we can continue to leverage. And hopefully we can get there. That way, it's not, we're stopping all business, transactions, but we're able to continue to support the business as we kind of build a better, more solid foundation underneath the software. And then we can continue to grow and to scale. But it is a challenge for sure.
Mentioning that there's about 70% that are going to fail, at what point are you too far gone? Because a lot of times organizations run out of money, right? And they run out of time because they run out of money. So as you're kind of stepping into these sorts of things, how do you, let's just say you're a fractional chief technology officer within an organization. They've assigned you, this role because they know that they're not going to meet their objectives, right, within the timeline. And they basically said, hey, look, we need to do something, or we need to trash this. Like, what objectively are you going to do as you walk in and step into that? Are you going to implement a particular process? Are you going to just, take some time to evaluate kind of what they have? Again, looking and assessing back to what are your objectives with this project to simplify it? Like, walk me through that process. Are you using an agile process or anything like that in your development?
So I really want to be able to evaluate the project, evaluate the team, the business. How does the business interact? And the amount of time that I have to do that evaluation kind of depends on the state of the project. If money is getting really low and we need to be able to deliver value quickly, then the amount of time I have to evaluate and kind of come up with a solution is just going to be much, much shorter. And I've certainly been on projects where I kind of had, a day or two to really do that quick evaluation and kind of put together a roadmap and start to change course really quickly. I think when we come to processes, it's easy for us to just say, oh, well, you're not doing this, so you should be doing Agile, or instead of Scrum, you should be using a Kanban type of approach or something along those lines. And for me, anytime that we talk about processes or frameworks, it has to come, I always look at what is the team capable of adopting? What, are they going to be willing to work within? Especially coming in as like a fractional CTO, it's easy for me to, with that kind of level of authority to say, we're going to do this. And I might get some mileage out of that, but typically the team is not going to be on board with that, kind of top-down edict. So I want to find ways that we can continue to move towards those key business objectives in a way that the team is willing to come along with me. It might be a little bit of pulling on my part, but I really want them to kind of be bought into the idea, because, I can't, build all the software on my own. I do need that team's support. And so I want to make sure that we continue to align there. But for me, at the end of the day, I'm always focused on what is the business objective? What is it that we're trying to do? And if what we're trying to do is something that's really, really simple, then it's very likely that we can throw away a lot of the complex software, a lot of the complex technologies that have been brought in, and just continue to refocus on what is it that we're trying to do for the business.
So do you find that for the most part, when you come into one of these projects that is not going well, that you're altering a significant amount of what they're doing, or are you just steering, just a smaller percentage to objectively start to create some milestones that they can hit over time? Because I'm curious, because you probably have gotten into a lot of different projects, what kind of heavy lifting objectively do you find yourself in, these projects that you're actually able to make, significant impact? Like, is it a short term or long term? And you mentioned, some of this being very project specific, but I am curious, at what point do people typically bring you in, and then what's kind of the term of that relationship in most cases?
So usually companies bring me in when they recognize that there's an issue, or someone in the organization kind of thinks that there might be an issue, but they're not quite sure. And so they're looking for me to kind of come in and just sit back and evaluate. Let's see if, we are headed in the right direction, or if what my gut is telling me from a leadership perspective is that things aren't going well, even though, on the surface, it might be some of our metrics might still be looking good. What my team is telling me is right, but something in there is telling me that something might not be quite right. And so I've been brought into projects because leadership just kind of wanted a second opinion, if you will.
Okay.
Or it's, we're having huge scalability issues, or huge stability issues where the system is down more times than it's up, or, we're introducing more bugs into the system than we're actually fixing as we're developing code. And so it may be anywhere from, certain processes, certain tools that we're using, the way that the team is developing and deploying software. It could be any number of things. I don't like to come in and just rip out everything all at once. I do like it to be kind of a gradual iteration. But my goal is that we can be successful as soon as possible. So really looking for those early wins, those low-hanging fruit, an ability to kind of show the team that, hey, what we're doing and what I'm proposing, we're moving in the right direction. Local development is a great place to start. If we can improve that process so that it's just a little bit easier for developers to kind of get up and running. I've been on projects where it wasn't necessarily the technology that was complicated, but it was the way that the software was architected that would prevent a new developer from being able to really contribute code on their own for the first 6 months. And that can be demoralizing for a developer to work on a project, but have to spend that amount of time just to kind of understand how things are built. And so I look at those as opportunities of, we can not only improve the way that new developers are onboarded, but we can also improve the way that the software is built so that we can focus on other business objectives. Like we want to add more users, or we want to add more features. And so there are different ways that we can kind of tie different ideas or objectives together, and the team can benefit and the business can benefit as well.
So I'm curious, simplicity obviously is the goal here, right? And so how do we take very complex things? You mentioned, hey, like I've got a developer who's maybe developing in a more complex way than necessary for this particular project, as an example. Like, what would be your go-to kind of strategy when you're stuck, within, a project that essentially is not moving forward primarily because it is too complex? And so, like, what would be your prescribed strategy to, again, maybe break that down to its simplest, core components, and then move forward to actually deliver a solution that is for the business needs?
So I think we can approach that in two different ways. And I think of it, it's coming at it from both directions, right? From a developer's perspective, what is kind of preventing me from being able to put this into place? Like, what is the first component, the first, section of code or, part of our architecture that is preventing me from moving forward? Is that something that we need? Is there a way that we can, circumvent it or get around that in some way? And then from the business perspective, coming at it from the other side, what is it, let's make sure that we're still aligned on what is it we're trying to do for the business. And, oftentimes what we see is that we had some sort of, very rough guidance or, requirement from the business, and we just allowed our engineering brains to kind of run wild with that. And like the example I always kind of pick on is, if the business comes to me and says, I need my data updated in real time, right? Quote unquote, real time. As an engineer, we have one perspective of that, right? And we start to get very excited, and we're, even if we're working for a small organization and we're not necessarily dealing with kind of FANG level data complexity or system complexity, we start to engineer solutions that look a lot like that. But for the business, the idea of real-time data updates could be very, very different. But if we don't have a shared definition and a shared understanding of what we mean, what is it that we're trying to achieve, then we can make things too complex on the engineering and the technology side that we never were even going to meet the goal on the business side. And, that's where we start to see a lot of challenges in the development process. So I always like to kind of continue to align what we're building with the technology back to the business. And then from a development perspective, I want to support my team members. I want to support my developers. So I want to understand what are the things that they're running into, because they may run into things that I might not be seeing that may or may not be an issue. And so I want to make sure that, I can help to remove those roadblocks when and where possible as well.
I imagine there's some push and pull when it comes to business objectives and maybe expectations that, say, a founder or leader might have on the project and what's actually possible. How many times do you find that it's just really miscommunication on both sides? Like you were talking about, like, hey, we don't have the same definition that we're operating by. And what percentage do you feel like you're just running into roadblocks because the complexity of what they're asking for is either beyond the scope of what the team is capable of, or it's beyond what technology can do for them today?
So I'll give some rough percentages, but I think by and large, let's say 90% of the problems that we encounter it's because we don't have that shared definition. We don't have that shared understanding. And then maybe, 10%, say 20% if we're being generous, maybe because of what we're trying to achieve with technology just isn't possible yet. We don't have the hardware, we don't have the capabilities within the team, whatever it may be. But I would say largely a lot of what I'm encountering and what I'm trying to kind of fix, if you will, is going to be on just a shared understanding of what is it that we're trying to achieve. And I think it kind of comes from both sides, right? Having an understanding of the business and what is it that we're trying to do. And then developers, right, after a certain amount of time, we get bored and we just don't want to build another simple CRUD application. So we kind of look for areas that we can make things a bit more complex, and we try and solve problems in new and interesting ways, even though that's not really what we need. And so just trying to, satiate both of those needs from the development perspective and from the business side.
Well, I think the statement you made at the beginning there, whether 90% is 100% accurate or not, overwhelmingly, it's because there's a miscommunication that that could be solved if you have the right people having the right conversations. So walk me through maybe an example of that. You don't have to name names, but of where you were able to kind of step in, again, reconnect the dialogue and then move a project forward. And maybe some of the mechanics involved with that particular example.
So there's a project I've been referencing quite a bit recently. And so earlier this year, I was brought into a project that it was not going well. Things were not moving along. We had missed deadlines. Things were really, really complex. And, a combination of scenarios kind of led to getting to that point. But when I was brought into the project, nothing was working. We had, it was almost like we went down the AWS console, like a drive-through menu, and just picked off items and added it to our software. And we just didn't need most of it. And so what I did was, I went back and really tried to understand from a business perspective, what is it that we're trying to do? And this was a perfect example of someone saying, I want the dashboard to be updated in real time. And for them, real time meant, well, I want to see the most up-to-date data within the last 24 hours. But the technologies that we had chosen was really to support globally distributed real time, like truly real time millisecond type of updates. And it wasn't something that we needed for the 10 users that we had on the system. And the team was just really overburdened. There was a lot of moving parts, and you could tell the team was demoralized. They were frustrated. And so what I did was I kind of came in and said, we don't have a lot of time to kind of turn this around. What is the simplest way that we can solve this particular problem? And what that resulted in was me pulling out about 80% of the technologies that we didn't need, aligning on a very narrow band of technologies, a single kind of framework, a single programming language. And then we were able to move forward with that. And that alone allowed us to not only scale how much data we could consume and process, but also our ability to scale the team and add additional developers when and where we needed to very easily. But really simplifying that was a huge win for that particular project.
So I'm curious, with a lot of the no code type stuff that is out there, is it necessary for most organizations that want to develop an app, to develop a software, for them to lean into custom code? Or for the most part, is there a solution out there, a simple solution, that a lot of times can be used or leveraged to solve the majority of needs where software would be applied?
I think there is. I really do. And I don't know about particular platforms. I know some folks have their favorites. For me, when I look at some of the low code and no code solutions, what I look for is what I call escape hatches. And really that's what is my ability to add on additional functionality that platform may or may not support now or in the future. How can I call out to a third-party REST API or call out to a different payment processor? Can I do that within this platform? And that platform gives me 80% of the functionality that I need. And then I only have to do either custom development or, some sort of integration for the other 20% to be able to get us there. Again, that delivers the business value. And a lot of times, most of the applications that we work on, we want to think that we're going to have huge user bases and tons of data that we're going to be processing. But by and large, a lot of the applications that we work on as developers, that's just not the case, especially for anything internal. We don't have those same requirements around the amount of data that we can process or the amount of users that we need to support. And so some of those tools are perfectly fine. They are limiting. They're just like any other framework. They certainly have their bounds, and it's hard to kind of escape those boundaries. But if we again understand what it is we're trying to solve, then we can go into evaluating those particular technologies with that mindset to say, okay, yes, these are the limitations. Can we potentially change part of the ways that we operate in order for us to fit into this particular framework or platform? And if we can, then we can deliver so much more quickly than if we had to, try and go get budget to then get a development team to then go and build custom software for the next 6 or 12 months. I like to think back to, I worked in finance for a while, and one of my projects was to convert existing Excel spreadsheets into actual custom software. And when we started to do some deep analysis, we found that, what we thought was maybe there were like 40 or so spreadsheets out there turned out to be well over 100 different Excel spreadsheets that were being used throughout the business so that folks could continue to do work and transact. And we were moving millions of dollars every day worth of transactions through simple Excel spreadsheets that were shared, between you and I. And that's how the business was working. And I like to think that that's probably one of our earlier versions of kind of the low code and no code solutions, where we were allowing folks and really providing a way for folks that don't have software development background to be able to develop business software, right? To continue to, automate and do the things that they needed to do for their job.
Yeah, I think that's really important too, to look at the applications within a business that can be automated, that are also maybe using the same system, like an Excel document. Excel obviously is used by so many different, organizations and skill sets. I think applied to that technology have grown within organizations over time as well. And I would argue that in many cases, a software solution isn't necessary. And a lot of times we start to build one because we feel it is necessary, but it may still be the most efficient one. So talk to me a little bit about, if you decide that it's, business critical to do something like this, how does simplification specifically around complexity and building these systems, how does that impact your ability to scale? Because you mentioned a lot of times the expectation is there's going to be a ton of users on this. And a lot of times that those objectives are never reached in the first place. And so if you're looking at this from a business standpoint, you're looking from an investment standpoint, how critical it is to build something that, first of all, works, so the investment isn't for naught, right? And secondarily, that it's maybe simple enough that, if you do have developers in or out of your business, that they can pick up where the last one left, because people don't work at the same place for 30 years anymore. That just doesn't work that way. So I'm just curious, how important is simplicity for long-term scaling of an organization? Depending on its application, of course.
I think it's incredibly important, right? Everywhere from the technologies that we choose, the frameworks, the architectures, really, it's much more possible for an organization to continue to grow and scale if they can hire folks. And so if we choose some esoteric language or framework or very complex architecture, it's much harder for us to find someone who either knows and understands those specific technologies or is willing to learn them. And when they join our organization, how successful are they going to be? And so I really look for how simple can we make things, right? I love a very simple, boring monolith architecture, right? That does so much. We're able to scale that. So many people on the internet, depending on which corner you go to, are going to argue that, anything above 1,000 users, we need to start moving to microservice architectures and, event-driven systems and all these things. Like certain scenarios, possibly, but by and large, most systems aren't going to grow to have anything more than 1,000 users. And most of these systems can scale just fine by having a couple instances running on a few different servers. And that's totally sufficient for what we're trying to do. So when it comes down to it, our ability to scale, it really comes down to what were the technologies and the architectures that we chose.
So I'm curious, in your perspective, if you were to lean one way or the other, who is responsible for the unnecessary complexity? Because I know there's a lot out there. I think that's probably why 70% of projects never make it to home plate. So in your personal opinion, is it expectations from senior leadership, or is it, software developers kind of justifying their existence?
As an engineer, as a developer, I think I would put the majority of the blame on software developers, honestly. There's a few reasons and ways that I kind of see that play out, right? So as we progress through our careers, right, early on, we're very excited. We want to build with all the different languages, all the different technologies. And then after a few years kind of professionally writing code, we start to get bored and we look for new and exciting ways that we can do things. The business necessarily hasn't really changed, right? Not in any big way. Right? Technology moves so much faster than anything else, right? And so we get bored and we want to try some of the new shiny technologies that are out there. And so then we try and find ways, right? We try and create problems to solve with these new technologies, with these new architectures, and we bring them into the equation. And so I think that developers, we aren't doing a great job for the business, and really, I think it's on us to go and understand the problem that we're trying to solve, try and really understand what is the impact from what we do as developers day in and day out. How does that play out in the business? What is the impact of a failed $1 million software project for the business, right? For us developers, we're still getting our big fancy software engineering salary. We've got the ability to jump to another organization in 18 months when we get bored with this one. But unfortunately, the business is stuck with whatever the heck it is that we built. And, that may or may not play out well. So, I think for me, a lot of the engineers that I work with and the teams that I work with, I really try and bring a lot of that ownership and responsibility back to the engineers. And, we are the professionals. It's our role. It's our responsibility to make sure that we understand the business side. And it's not, I think where we get kind of off track is that there's an expectation that, the business, they just need to learn technology. They don't know how hard it is to develop software. They don't know. And I think it's our job as developers to really go and help educate and partner with our stakeholders in a way that we are able to be, effective, and we can all get to the same, finish line together.
Yeah, I think ownership from both sides is important, but I was interested to hear your perspective on that, because as a non-techie type person, right? Like I definitely know technology mostly from the business side, less from the technical, code writing side. It's always interesting for me to understand, like, okay, well, all the pieces need to come together for us to objectively to deploy a software that's great for the users, whether that's an internal technology that we're just using to, provide services to our clients or whatever, or it's client facing or customer facing, right? And so I'm always interested to kind of hear the dynamics, because I think, simple doesn't sound like fun, right? Simple doesn't sound like fun. It sounds like, that's a little bit boring. But, as Steve Jobs says, simple is hard, right? It's not easy. It's not an easy thing to do. So I'm always interested to hear different perspectives, because I do feel like many of the, software developers I've met across my career are doing very complex things. But how do we simplify those complex things in such a way that somebody could step into your seat who has the same general background that you do and pick up exactly where you left off, know exactly what you were doing, right? And how can we make those things, connected to the business and more in sync? So I love your perspective. I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you, from a simplicity standpoint, what you think AI is actually doing to the marketplace. So I've got to hit you with that. Like, do you think it's making things more complex, or do you truly believe that it's actually simplifying things? At least some of the general AI that we have, or sorry, not general AI, the large language models and some of the other things, you see ChatGPT writing code. Is it accurate? Is it actually working? Are software developers using it, or are they just playing with it right now? Like, what is your perspective?
I do think that it will help. There's certainly edge cases and concerns that I have around, well, do I just accept the code that AI generated for me and say, okay, well, if it works, it looks like it works, then it must work, and I'm going to go ahead and put it out into production. Honestly, we saw the same thing 10 years ago when developers would go onto Stack Overflow, copy and paste the first answer that had the most upvotes, put it right into their software. If it compiled, they shipped it. They didn't understand what was going on within that code. I think we have the same scenario at play now. It's just AI generates it so much more quickly, and it's already integrated into our development environments. Now, with that said, it's hugely powerful. I was on a call, a half an hour ago, and I needed to try and figure out how to put together an Nginx configuration. So I quickly jumped into ChatGPT, went through a couple iterations of a prompt, and had exactly what I was looking for. That's amazing, because that, maybe a couple years ago, because it's not a technology I use every day, it would have taken me maybe an hour and a half to put together a working solution and kind of testing that out. Where now with ChatGPT, it took me a couple minutes to get to the same end result. Now, what I think is important is I also have many years of experience to know what I'm looking at and if it's good or not. And I think one of the big challenges we're going to continue to have is that the more that AI systems are writing this, there's a lot more trust put into what is being generated. And that may be misplaced trust. I think we still need to have the skill and the experience and the expertise to be able to look at what has been generated and know if it's actually what we want versus just, kind of copying it, putting it right in, and then moving on. But we're just faster at doing that sort of thing now with AI.
Yeah, I think you probably get similar hallucinations when it's writing code as you would if it's writing a blog post or something. Somebody's using it for some marketing collateral or, an outline or things like that. If you stretch it beyond what, really its limits. And there's a lot of data in there that they fed this thing, but at the end of the day, it has its limits, right? Because, in software development, many times you are writing new code to do a very specific thing. And if that doesn't exist in the system, if it's never been written before, then obviously it's not going to be able to provide an accurate solution to the problem.
Right.
But I do love your perspective there, because I think the efficiency of AI is, you can't ignore it. But the simple fact is you still need people to check the work, right? And I think it's important that we understand that. And so for simplicity's sake, using it is definitely something that you're going to see more and more. But I definitely believe that it's going to be so important. It's going to be key that, we try to not make that any more complex than it needs to be. Because ultimately, if our objectives are to deliver a quality product, quality solution, not fall into that 70% that never actually gets to the finish line, I think it's important that we maybe scale back on maybe even our expectations sometimes, but also, some of the complexity around software. And I think everybody can get on board with that, when you look at it from a 40,000 foot view. But maybe when you're in the trenches every single day and you're a little bit bored, it might be a little difficult, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So what would you suggest? Last question. What would you suggest, Brian, that if somebody's getting bored with a project, instead of trying to make the project more complicated than it needs to be, what would you suggest they do? Because they obviously want to be stimulated. I don't have a problem with that. But I can see the downside to them, making a project that should be pretty straightforward more complex than necessary.
I mean, there's a number of different ways that I've seen successful. So if it's specific to a project, I like to use the rule of one, right? I don't want to introduce more than one new thing to a project that the team is not familiar with. So it's not a new architecture, it's not a new technology. We only get to add one new thing to a new project. And that's our opportunity to learn and continue to grow and to upskill. Outside of that, I always encourage developers to, look at things like moonlighting or freelancing opportunities as a way to get small side projects that they can continue to work on and grow. Whether it's something that's, aligned to a hobby that they have that's really interesting, or they go and find a small organization that's looking to build something and they can, help build a software package for a nonprofit that could potentially benefit them. Again, making sure that it's simple and aligned with the business or the objectives for that particular project. But that's a great way to be able to continue to grow and learn those specific skills. I encourage organizations to open up opportunities for their developers to play around with some of those new technologies, right? If they have an expectation that all of my developers have AWS experience, what are some of the ways as an organization we can make AWS and some of those trainings and certifications available to developers so that we can continue to help them to grow and evolve in their careers, right? And that's a great way to help try and retain development talent as well, as if we can give those opportunities, right? Hackathons and those sorts of things are great ways to open up those opportunities. But really, it's, again, back to that kind of idea of ownership. It's a lot of that comes down to the developer, and it's up to us as developers. If we want to continue to grow and evolve and mature in our careers, we need to take that initiative. We need to do those things. One of the biggest risks to failed software projects is something that I've heard referred to as resume-driven development. I want to add a bunch of new technologies to a project so that I can say on my resume that I've used these these technologies in production, so then I can move on to my next job, right? The current organization that I'm at doesn't benefit from that. And so trying to find other ways to get exposure to those technologies is something I'm always looking for as a developer.
I love that. Look, that should work for both sides, right? You're giving your developers an opportunity to add something new to every project, and then you're stimulating them by either allowing them to work a side gig. Maybe it could be, nonprofit, sort of focus thing, or it could be outside of the specific realm where you would have non-compete problems. But most importantly, giving them an opportunity to experience new things. Whether it's certifications or new technologies, so they can continue to develop their skills and not stay stagnant, because we know technology is ever evolving. So I want to thank you for coming on here, Brian, and sharing your experience and wisdom to kind of guide us through this journey of simplicity. I think it's important, right? I think the world is complex enough for our technology and software to be written in such a way that, first of all, a lot of them aren't getting the finish line, but secondly, that they're just not maybe achieving their goals in the most straightforward and possible way. I think is incredibly important. So I want to thank you for coming on here and kind of sharing that with us. I also like to ask, what's the best way if, say, somebody is listening to this and they want to connect with you or have follow-up questions for you?
Yeah, the best way to reach out to me is I'm most active on LinkedIn. So I would encourage folks to connect with me on there, send me a message. I'm happy to chat anytime. We can set up a quick call and find out ways that I might be able to help.
Awesome. And to our listeners, thank you so much for listening today. I hope that you'll like the episode and subscribe for further episodes so you can stay connected with us. Stay techie. We'll see you next week. Take care.